I was in mute.
Ándale, ok.
Bienvenido, buenas noches. Bienvenidos a este jueves de SOMA. Tendría que haber sucedido el día de ayer, miércoles, como siempre. Por causas de fuerza mayor no fue así. Afortunadamente las cosas ahora están un poco mejor y decidimos tomarnos este jueves para hacer aquello que tendríamos que haber hecho ayer. El día de hoy nos acompaña Cristóbal Martínez y es la tercera intervención de Miércoles de SOMA en el programa de SOMA Summer, Ghost and a Guys Walk into a Bar and Nobody Noticed. El día de hoy, Cristóbal va a presentarnos una plática y tendremos una conversación sobre el DEI, Diversity, Equality and Inclusion. Voy a leer su CV en inglés para quienes no estén familiarizados con el trabajo de Cristóbal y su relevancia en el contexto del arte contemporáneo y diría yo también como del discurso y la retórica contemporánea. Entonces, me permito hacer esto en inglés y sí, la charla creo que iremos del inglés al español back and forth.
Okay.
Cristóbal Martínez, PhD, is from Alcalde, New Mexico, and is of the Genízaro Pueblo, Manito, and Chicano people in northern New Mexico, including Española, Abiquiu, Velarde, and Po Si Pangea, Embudo, and Dixon. He's an artist, digital designer, publishing scholar, and professor of expanded arts at Arizona State University. Martinez co-founded the Artist Hacker Ensemble Radio Healer in 2003, joined the internationally acclaimed artist collective Post-Commodity in 2009, and co-created with post-Mexican artist-composer Guillermo Galindo the experimental electronic music ensemble Red Culebra in 2018. Martinez has dedicated his life and career to interdisciplinary collaboration in contemporary art and continues his work within these groups. In his collaborative and solo work, Martinez uses mixed media, digital media, and aesthetics to position generative metaphors intended to mediate complexity within diverse spatial, temporal, social, cultural, political, ecological, and economic contexts. He aspires to make poetic and idea-driven, propositional, and self-implicating art that reimagines sites of contest, controversy, conflict, and consequence into those of generative public pedagogy, curiosity, and discourse. Martinez has exhibited nationally and internationally, including Contour Bienal in 2011 in Mechelen, Belgium, Adelaida International in 2012 in Australia, 18th Bienal in Sydney, Australia, Scottsdale Museum of Contemporary Art in Arizona in 2017, the Whitney Biennial in New York, Art in General, New York, Documenta 14 in Athens, Greece, and Kassel, Germany, the 57th Carnegie International in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, the Walker Art Center in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and many others, San Francisco Art Institute, LaxArt, Los Angeles, Minneapolis Institute of Art, Renine Modern Museum. I mean, and I could go on, but more than these formalities, I think it's going to be like a really relevant topic, you know, to understand how you situate yourself, you know, regarding your identity or post-identity in this very contested and I would say weaponized discourse of what has been known or come to be known as diversity, equality, and inclusion, and the problems and, you know, instrumentalizations that has suffered and that I do believe has made for a more contested or difficult way to bridge gaps, to bridge divergences, and generally speaking, to enter in discourse or conversations with one another. And to me, that feels more than relevant, important, and should be addressed in the most critical of ways, which I think you are more than prepared to do. And without further ado, please, my friend, welcome. Thank you so much for sharing. And the floor on this screen is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ricardo. Buenas noches a todos. Y quiero dar la gracia a SOMA a Ricardo por convidarme a hablar esta noche. I would love to present to you tonight in Spanish, but I'm going to present to you in English because this technical discourse, this academic discourse is not something that I would be very proficient at in Spanish. Yo hablo mucho español y spanglish con mi familia en Nuevo México, de cosas, de cosas que hablan familias, pero de la academia no hablamos mucho de eso. So no tengo mucho práctica. So I apologize, but I will be presenting to you in English tonight. I just want to share with you a little bit about, I want to show you an example of my work, and that should, just to provide you with a little more context about who I am, the sort of positionality, the place from which I'm speaking to the topic that I've been invited to discuss with you tonight. So I'm going to show you this piece that was completed. Let me share my screen here. Get going. Is this coming through okay? Okay, so I'm going to, I want to share with you this work by the Indigenous Artist Collective Post Commodity. And Post Commodity is comprised of Kate Twist, who is from the Cherokee Nation, and myself. At the time of this installation, Post Commodity was comprised of Kate Twist, myself, and Raven Chacon, who is Navajo, Dene, and Chicano also. So this work that I'm showing you is called Repellent Fence, or Valla Repelente. It's a 2-mile-long land art sculpture that intersected the U.S.-Mexico border. It's an ephemeral monument, and it intersected the U.S.-Mexico border for 4 days. It's comprised of 26 balloons, helium balloons, that are 10 feet in diameter and are consisting of a bird repellent product that you can buy at the hardware store. Here in the United States, you could go to Home Depot. If you have birds that are eating your fruit or shitting in your driveway and you want to repel the birds, you go and you buy one of these balloons, only it's about the size, it's about this size, a little bit bigger than a basketball or a soccer ball, football, and you blow it up and you hang it, and it's got tiene un ojo repelente, and it's supposed to scare the birds away. And it only lasts for about a day, and then all the birds come back, and this is an ineffectual product, something that's designed with embedded obsolescence, and in a lot of ways, I feel we felt like describes the relationship, the commodities that oftentimes drive the relationships between the U.S. and Mexico. At the same time, these balloons are also beautiful to the collective. They are, it's a coincidence, but they use colors, medicine colors that are sacred to indigenous peoples throughout all of the Americas. And then the other thing that's a coincidence is that the eye, a nosotros, la gente indígena aquí en los Estados Unidos, we don't see this eye para nosotros no, esto no es un ojo repelente, pero it's like an eye of knowledge, an eye of awareness, an eye of consciousness. So it has a very different meaning for us as an indigenous collective. So these balloons are kind of like a double meaning. They demonstrate the relationship built on commodities and capitalism that the U.S. and Mexico share between one another, and can at times be ineffectual. And well, at the same time, there's a spiritual mediated aspect to this, where we share medicine, we share a history, we're connected, this is like a suturing, a remembering, and building a public memory of us shared and continuing relationships that pre-existed well before Europeans came to the Americas. This work, although it was up for only 4 days, it represents 10 years of work, 10 years of labor to create this, and especially 3 years of very intense binational diplomacy, where we work with federal agencies in the United States and in Mexico, state agencies, the state of Arizona and Sonora. And then also this was installed near the transborder cities of Douglas, Arizona, and Agua Prieta, Sonora. And it required the kind of international cooperation as well as local cooperation, and between all stakeholders in the region, all of them, including people who are there and organized around things like anti-immigration. So it really required a lot of diplomacy, a lot of political diplomacy, in order to create the safety and conditions by which we could pause and have a discourse, an international and transborder discourse about recovering knowledge about the border. Here's just another image of it. So this is a little bit about what I do as an artist. I make a lot of work like this that requires cooperation and conversations. And so I've been invited tonight to talk a little bit about the concept, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And for the purposes of having a critical discussion, I'll try to move through this rather quickly, so that I can take questions and maybe we can engage in some conversation. But before I begin, I want to share with you that this lecture is really a thought piece. It's anecdotal and based on my personal experiences and observations as a person, artist, and scholar. So this is not coming from a scholarly perspective. This is coming more from an embodied perspective. So it's built around my experiences as a Mexican American on this side of the border, living in the borderlands, and a scholar and an artist, and some things that I've observed and have thought about, and also some things that I've learned as well through some scholarly work. So one of the things that I want to say about diversity, equity, and inclusion is that context is very important. This is largely an idea that is situated within the context of the United States. And there's other countries as well, but what I'm going to speak to tonight is about the United States as a context for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And other contexts also consist of capitalism in the United States, and also the discourse of the US Constitution, and specifically the US Bill of Rights. And so in addition to this context, it's also important to share with you that a lot of times the framework for diversity, equity, and inclusion is it's coming from theories of intersectionality, and that the discussion would be centered around or the discussion or the pursuit of creating equity comes through the discussion of inclusion, so that a lot of times the framework is that people are going to look at injustices that span a variety of what would be referred to as marginalized people. And that could range, that could be across class, it could be across race, it could be include discourses of indigeneity, disability, gender, sexual orientation, race, ethnicity, it goes on. And so it's the idea that within a social structure, an economic structure in the United States, that inequities and inequalities are structured and interlinked. And so that's oftentimes a framework that one might encounter within a DEI discourse in the United States. And then I want to share with you, well, where does all this come from? Where does this idea come from? And Ricardo characterizes it as an ideology, and it is an ideological, or an idea, and it does have its own ideology, like any idea or any discourse. It's a lot of this DEI has arisen out of a set of histories that include, in the United States, Native self-determination and sovereignty, Native American self-determination and sovereignty, women's rights, LGBTQ plus rights, civil rights, labor rights, disability rights, and there's oftentimes this these histories, these rights, people fighting for their rights happen within presences and experiences and structures of discrimination. And forms of discrimination are oftentimes, I perceive them as and they're just, and they oftentimes justify the cause for DEI as a response. And some of these forms of discrimination include racism, classism, xenophobia, anti-LGBTQ plus, ableism, labor exploitation. And so you'll notice I mentioned xenophobia, and since we're having a conversation and I'm presenting to you from the United States, and you all are in Mexico right now, and we think about immigration because getting caught up in this discourse as well. And so forms of discrimination in the United States are sometimes argued as social challenges that are rooted in colonization. And this happens sometimes, not all the time. within the nation state, the United States, and representing ongoing colonization, American Indian nations are in a federal trust relationship with the United States federal government that are built around treaties and indigenous self-determination and sovereignty. And under this, indigenous American Indian nations maintain self-governance and are and do work very hard to preserve and advance self-governance, including land and resources and food systems, culture, indigenous knowledge, language, autonomy, political autonomy. And in my experiences, indigenous self-determination and sovereignty is often overlooked and misunderstood within DEI discourses, actions, and policies in the United States. In this country, I oftentimes observe that it incorrectly gets conflated with race, civil rights, and democracy. Another thing that I'd like to share with you is that in US politics, many who advocate for DEI are operating under theories that the implications of discrimination in terms of things such as racism, classism, xenophobia, anti-LGBTQ+, ableism, labor exploitation, create the conditions by which the US Bill of Rights are transgressed under a variety of circumstances for citizens that face discrimination. So that your advocates of DEI would cite these forms of discrimination and see that the rights that are guaranteed by the U.S. Constitution are oftentimes transgressed, and that not only that the rights themselves, but the philosophies that are foundational to the Bill of Rights, such as the idea that every citizen has the right to life, liberty, and happiness, that DEI is really trying to advance this Jeffersonian concept, and in an effort to build the equity and equality around these rights. And so within a capitalist and meritocratic superstructure by which we in the United States are suspended, it may be implicitly logical to consider that the right to life, liberty, and happiness is in part determined, either privileged or compromised by one's capacity or lack thereof to operate within such a system. And oftentimes it requires money to operate within such a system effectively, or some kind of capital, social capital or political capital or financial capital. But there are other aspects, unfortunately, and the implications of various forms of discrimination have structural consequences that they give rise to a variety of social issues in the United States. These issues are tied to hiring practices, employment wages, labor rights, social rights, public safety, health services, institutional access and representation, education, and from my observations, DEI is, and it's common knowledge that the idea is manifesting as politically contested policies within the United States. And as they seek to mitigate issues such as, for example, women getting paid less than men to perform the same labor, demographic imbalances within educational systems, demographic imbalances within penal systems, demographic imbalances within executive and occupational positions of power, police brutality against people of color, anti-immigration, institutional disparities across race and ethnicity, and health services disparities across race, ethnicity, and gender. So there's a lot of social disparities within the socio-cultural and political and economic spheres of within the United States. And so this last thing I want to share with you is, I've provided you a kind of context and a history and explain to you, what is DEI, like what does it emerge from? What is it trying to respond to? What are the issues? And so in all of this, as a person of color, I oftentimes, because of the racializing nature of the society in the United States, I am a person of color. And a few of my concerns and observations, I kind of get brought into this conversation because that often does happen to people of color within positions of, for example, institutional power, like myself. We are consulted and oftentimes put in and encouraged and put in position to address these issues. And so, a few of my concerns and observations about DEI include the following, and I put a set of bullet points together to share with you, and I'm just going to read them off to you. Here are some of my concerns and observations about DEI, and then I want to open it up to questions. Concerns and observations include in DEI, there are misunderstandings, misrepresentations, misappropriations of decolonization rhetorics and scholarship and frameworks. There is often a lack of a deeper awareness of and accountability toward Native self-determination and sovereignty, which I shared with you earlier. There's often a lack of understanding the historical and legal differences between Native sovereignty and civil rights. Those are two different things. Civil rights was led by leaders such as Martin Luther King, and labor rights gets wrapped into this, like Cesar Chavez in the San Joaquin Valley in California. And that's not the same. The people are fighting for equality in these within these histories and contexts, whereas Indigenous people, federally recognized Native nations, maintain that they hold inherent sovereign right to the land and to their lifeways by virtue of being first peoples in this hemisphere. And so those are two very different things. Understanding Indigenous people and indigeneity, this is another issue that I find that is sort of missing within DEI, is that the discourse doesn't always, from my perspective, it doesn't understand Indigenous people, understand that Indigenous people and indigeneity extends south beyond the US-Mexico border. and that such a reality exists within the borders of the United States. And historically throughout the borderlands where the US and Mexico are in closest geopolitical and geocultural proximity to one another. There's also an issue with intersectionality, and I find that in some cases I've observed that it can cause invisibility in advocacy based on a lack of equal representation across peoples facing discrimination. So you might have people within a DEI committee, for example, that don't have a lot of knowledge about people who are labeled with disabilities. And so therefore, a lot of the work might focus on race, but not will not, but advocacy or might, such a thing might raise invisibility for other groups that also require justice. And so I oftentimes struggle with the DEI as a singular umbrella because it can create the misperception that this is capable of solving all forms of discrimination, and that discrimination is monolithic and as opposed to comprised of complex systems. And I think DEI oftentimes aspires to acknowledge complexity in these complex systems, but then I oftentimes see it fail in its aspirations because there's a lot of lack of knowledge and discrimination within the groups themselves that have to do with sometimes a lack of representation or a lack of knowledge or other agendas or other motives that are very much about us being us as humans. And I oftentimes think that DEI leads to reductionist models of discrimination and the notion that complex systems can be solved just through workshops and training. And that, I think, creates a lot of cynicism and oftentimes doesn't seem to be a good faith effort to really solve problems. DEI is often used for mitigating corporate and institutional liability, and sometimes I think many of us think that that's what the workshops are really for, and that's serves a very important purpose of what kind of work they're actually up to, and that those who face discrimination are made responsible for fixing broken systems that they themselves are subjugated by. This is the one thing that troubles me the most about DEI. And I want to repeat it again, that those who face discrimination are made responsible for fixing broken systems that they themselves are subjugated by and didn't construct to begin with. And that that DEI is used by subjugating systems of power to project politically favorable opportunities and optics. So a lot of times it's rhetorical, but it doesn't manifest. Change doesn't manifest in policy or economically or in education or healthcare, or things that all people need, and things that we're basic human. They're human rights that we all ideally bear responsibility for, in making sure that we all have what we need and share what we need. That DEI is rhetorical. It does not function beyond symbolic exchanges. It does not function very well. And that DEI distracts those that face discrimination from being part of decision-making processes that are foundational to institutions. So if I, as a person of color, happen to be on an academic committee that is a DEI committee, that takes me away from other committees where my voice could be very transformative. I have a few more, just a couple more, three more. I'm also concerned that DEI is hegemonically operating through the lens of damage-centered narratives, and that the selfie without criticality of its the idea that the DEI doesn't oftentimes think critically about how we use this position selfie as a metaphor where we reflect on trauma narratives as a way to build a case for reparations and justice. It does come with a cost. If we really start to believe we are in fact damaged, it's harder to make marks of assent. I believe, this is a belief, when you feel that you're damaged. It can be difficult. And that DEI can be reactive and not strategic. And DEI is becoming increasingly partisan. It's full-on partisan in US politics right now, which make it less productive nationally in terms of a larger national aspiration. So thank you so much again. And I just want to go ahead and open it up now for questions, ideas, thoughts, and conversation. I can't see you in the Zoom, and I'm going to assume that Ricardo is going to mediate some of this. So, but I know you're there, and again, it's an honor to be here with you tonight. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cristóbal. Yeah, I will try to mediate. Yeah, we have certain technical restrictions on how our conversation can go. I hope it goes well in that regards of, technology relying on the questions, and that we can move on from there. But I mean, there's like so much to go from it. And I was thinking, first and foremost, you spoke about the positionality, and I was wondering also about this, I would say, like a strict, and in my view, I cannot see how to turn it around, but this paradox of your position as belonging to the original nations, that in itself, I'm sure is already contested ground. What does it mean to be original nation, and what does it represent? But in regards of this little third word of the three little words, the inclusion thing, because then how to include a sovereignty of no borders, of a claim to a land, resources, and culture. How can they be included into this other level of the federal nation state under the Jeffersonian ideal? For me, that's first and foremost one big distinction that you have made.
Right.
So
yeah, there's the idea of the United States, I think, as a concept, a national concept, is that's I think an aspirational concept. It's not one that I think is I think Americans know this. It's not a realized dream, if you will. It's got an aspirational quality to it, and if whether or not the nation moves towards this aspiration or away from it, we're kind of in a moment now where our political system is going to reveal some very important is going to render that really, I think, more legible of whether we're moving toward some of these aspirational ideologies or we're abandoning them. And we, I mean, just the vote. Obviously, there's great complexity. But I think that a lot of the ideas are the idea of DEI has got a lot of dilemmas, and some of these things are irreconcilable. And so people who are trying to move the conversation in a manner that is going to provide better quality of life for more people in the US will find themselves having to work through this framework, despite the dilemmas and despite its imperfections and its contradictions. And I find that DEI isn't just like a place where justice happens. It becomes a mechanism through which justice remains contested and ideas of justice remain contested. So it's not a space that is just like complicated by partisan politics, but within itself, it's also complicated by both cognitive dissonance, narrative incongruencies, contradictions, and internal disagreements. And so it's a very noisy environment and can be a very noisy environment and framework through which to solve problems. This is what we have right now, and it's not, I wouldn't consider it to be very stable because of the overall political nature of the United States right now, in the emergent present.
Yeah. I have like a little bit more follow-up, but maybe thinking of that contestation, which I like the notion that, justice cannot be, fixed as a notion, because it can take us back into a few things of what you already mentioned. But I have one question that also includes the idea of mestizaje, which I think it's interesting to this same issue. So, I will try to read it and see how it goes, because as our interrogation counterpart, he says like it's a long-winded question, but I will try to read it as best as I can. So it says, I have a question regarding the concept mestizaje, which, for those unaware, is the process of racial cultural mixing between the Spanish and the indigenous populations of Mexico. From my understanding, after the Mexican Revolution, the government adopted and promoted the mestizo ideology to create a unified Mexican identity with no racial distinctions.
Yeah.
This concept perpetuates erasures with a Eurocentric view of history and ignores the complex and diverse racial and ethnic backgrounds that make up Latin America. It
Yeah.
ignores whiteness as a part of Latin America and Mexico. I have 2 paragraphs to go. Yet conversation about whiteness may be perceived as undermining this narrative of harmonious racial blending. Has mestizaje been commodified like the way DEI discourses has in the United States? How do we contend with the history of mestizaje while still promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion in Mexico?
That's a brilliant question. One of the things that so I've been I'm implicated in advancing the mestizo discourse, and part of the way that I am implicated in that discourse is that I was raised to understand myself as mestizo by my community and my family. Also Hispanic, also Chicano, also Mexicano, also now Latino, and then now it's Latinx, and it's crazy, and also too I think that they're all problematic, every single one of them, for the same reason. I think that there are degrees of nefariousness at play. Like, let's look at Latinx, for example. Like, why are people referring to themselves as Latinx when we don't speak Latin? Yeah, we speak a Latin language, some of us better than others, obviously, but the idea is that the language is like from thousands of miles away from here, and in its genesis, and looking at Latin as part of the etymology of, or part of the history of the language of Spanish, for example, doesn't it serves to occlude our indigeneity, and then you have things like Hispanic that do the same thing, that go back to Hispania, and those things don't value or recognize my a whole major trunk of my ancestry, starting with my very father, and then you go down to like mestizo, where you're trying to find the middle ground, but that was born of a caste system used in Mexico and in my homeland too, because at one point New Mexico is called New Mexico because it was once part of Mexico. And so a lot of the things that exist in Mexico and that are the legacy of Mexico's history are also the legacy of New Mexico's history. And the people of New Mexico are contending with the legacy of Mexico's history. Well, they have to also contend with the history of the United States history, and they layer on top with United States, Mexico, and then New Spain on the bottom, and there is I agree with everything that is said about the idea of the mestizo, and I think that the identity project of the mestizo and that sort of cosmic and romantic idea really hurt us all, and I really believe it led to the ultimate concept of Latin, the Latino or Latina or the Latinx that just really does all of really creates erasure. It really reinforces shame. It really causes a genesis amnesia of who we are and where we're from. And so for me, the way that I talk about my work, because I'm the one Mexican-American artist who is invited to participate in an indigenous artist collective that was founded by American Indian artists. And it is a vision of American Indian artists. I have to understand what limitations I bring to the table, given my positionality. And then I also have to understand how I can complicate and extend the capacity of the concept of an indigenous collective. And so I've thought a lot about your question. And for me, where I'm from in New Mexico, I'm from a little pueblito called Alcalde. And in New Mexico, you have a lot of Potzipangue, Santa Clara, Oque Owingue. There are Taos, San Ildefonso. There are a lot of pueblos. There are Tewa, Tiwa, Towa pueblos that are the indigenous pueblos, and they're federally recognized Native American pueblos in New Mexico. And then there are a lot of pueblos that were also indigenous pueblos. They have been over the course of history, have been come to be viewed as colonial villages. But the pueblito that I come from, it's not federally recognized. It's called Alcalde. And all of the people of the region, whether you're in a pueblo that's federally recognized, a Native American pueblo, or you're a pueblo where you have a lot of people of mixed race descent that are tied to our history and that tie very much in a northernmost way to Mexico, the history of Mexico, I would be referred to as alcaldeño. And so there is a cultural specificity to that. And it's not this big, grand, cosmic vision of this mixed race human who brings all of these great things together from these great cultures. It's very humble and very complicated, but also hugely legible and very much geospatially and geopolitically tied to land in ways that resolve and work well and in ways that are super problematic. And so I come from, yo soy alcaldeño, but nobody will understand that within a DEI framework. No one will understand that within a Latinx framework, or even in a broader Latinx or Latin American concept of the mestizo. And so an alcaldeño has a very, very specific history. It is very much tied to land and place. And I think that's part of where we need to go, is we need to go back to asking ourselves, what are the relationships we have to land and our families? And how do we see ourselves in relationship to the land? And how do we understand in what ways does the land mediate the relationships we have to each other? And I think that helps to mitigate, and at least begins to help to mitigate the erasure and subjugation of our of our indigeneity, the aspects of us that are indigenous, of our indigenous relations and ancestors and so forth.
Yeah, no, I'm really interested in that. It seems to me that somehow what you just explained, the way I can glean it, is that the mestizo ideal, which is very much trying to look into the future with some, the raza cósmica by Vasconcelos ideal.
Yeah.
Basically it's like to continue this suppression or this invisibilization of the complexities, in order to keep the totem pole of, the feudal system that was imposed, because, in the end, Vasconcelos was on top, like we're all mestizos, but yeah, I'm on top.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And this very, the way you close also the argument of this super specificity towards the land, which is basically the ultimate resource of nation state, because, lands equal oil or lithium or, territory versus tax,
Okay.
like that's.
There is one thing listening to you that I really want to share with the group. Because the discourse of this identity project that's taken place in Latin America and in Mexico and the borderlands, this mestizo discourse that has subjugated indigenous knowledge and memory and often a sense of who we are, it's, in my opinion, really disadvantaged immigrants from south of the US-Mexico border. And the way that I see this playing out in post-commodity, and I showed you the work that we did at the beginning of my talk, and post-commodity has thought about this deeply. It's that when you're using certain Hispanic Eurocentric rhetorics to subjugate indigeneity, it creates an amnesia, a forgetfulness of who you are and a part of who you are. And it makes it easy for those who are anti-immigration to cast what, in my view, are indigenous people as alien. And that is crazy to me, because people who are being characterized as alien within the borders of the United States are some of the oldest peoples of the Western Hemisphere. But if you cannot remember the indigeneity, you cannot combat a marginalizing discourse that would seek to render one stateless. And this is the kind of ongoing colonization of indigenous people that I continue to see in the Americas. If people, for example, immigrants from Mexico or Guatemala, or let's say someone from Mexico could say, the word Mexico is the derivative of a Nahuatl language. And Mexica, in part, means the people of the Maguey. It could, something as simple as remembering rhetorically can really neutralize the capacity of people to make the claim that immigrants are alien. So, we have to find, I think, a way to remember. And part of remembering, if mestizo is not a way to remember and it has a bad history and it's problematic, we need to invent new language. And we have invented new language, just, I believe, the wrong language. We invented this thing called Latinx or Latino. And I don't know how, I don't even believe that that's strongly used in Latin America. And it would be very much a phenomena in the United States. But I know that there is a dialogue, and I know that I think I just want to push against that.
Yeah, no, totally agree that there's like this contestation, and yeah, the less that we remember, and I don't know if I can say even we, because I don't remember anymore.
Yeah.
and it's the only way of, because at some point during your talk you were referring to, this notion that in order to be included in this American dream, somehow you already have to be complicit or already have to have accomplished, to be included. You already have to accomplish to be part of that system. Otherwise, you have no political or no capital power to be included. So it's an interesting conundrum.
So then people feel they need to fight.
Yeah.
And then you end up with the political soup. But yeah, this is it is certainly a conundrum. Yes.
Yeah, I don't know, and I think that in that action of remembering, that what we can change is precisely that version of the mestizo already solving the problem for us. Already getting rid of this.
It doesn't. It doesn't.
Of course, it doesn't.
But yeah, I laugh. There's a comedy to the concept. Now that we have enough knowledge, and we can look back on our history to see, what it did or what it's doing, and understand what it's doing, and maybe we can't fully remember. Fortunately, in the place where I'm from, we have oral traditions and cultural knowledge and agricultural knowledge, and that we can remember. We have enough living knowledge to remember very well. But sometimes we will choose not to remember correctly because of systems of subjugation and racism and capitalism and competition, and lots of things that problematize and impede our potential. But we can also recover a lot of knowledge we've forgotten. But we have to create the conditions so that this can happen. And sometimes recovering knowledge requires building new public memory. And I really think that, Mexico has such an opportunity to do that, because, even like visiting Mexico City, and I was recently there with artist Guillermo Galindo, who was born and raised in Mexico City. The evidence is all around, the evidence is everywhere. You could go to the Zócalo or El Centro, and you're seeing how layerings, but the people are still the people. You know, it's still a Tenochtitlan, and the piece of the Templo Mayor excavated and revealed, and it's like right there. And so you just have to go back to it and be with it and make meaning with it. And new memory and knowledge is possible and can be recovered.
Yeah, I will try to come back to that idea, because that brings me to the notion of recuperation, you know, because within all of this DEI thing, of course, there's like, you know, you could say rightful claims, you know, like rightful wrongs, so to speak, included in that thing, but it has been so co-opted and instrumentalized. You know, you have to belong to be included somehow. You know,
that's very. I think that's very much a human thing. You know, I have a doctorate in linguistics and social linguistics, and that's one of the things that we do with language. We create groups, and then we'll use our language and linguistic communities within groups to determine who's in and who's out. And that, I think that really ties to a question that's in the chat.
Yeah, I wanted to.
Do you mind if I read it and tackle it?
Please do.
Okay. It says, as you speak, you keep referring to DEI as an entity with its own will. For example, DEI is used for mitigating institutional liabilities, or DEI presents itself as a solution to discrimination. It's interesting how difficult it seems to pin down its more material human reality. And so, you know, this is what we do as humans. We use metaphors in order to be able to unpack complex ideas. DEI is a lot of things. It's derivative of human behavior and thought and ideas and ideology and politics and so forth. I'm using the DEI as person metaphor, personifying DEI as a way to assert the theory that it is a discourse with a capital D, and that discourse with a capital D has influence over us, and it's a feedback loop. It's influencing us, and we're influencing it, and that's a lot of what we do with language when we're in relationship to one another as humans. And so that's why that, you know, DEI is person metaphor sort of rises in my language. But what my intention is to show that it is a discourse with a capital D. And what I mean by that is that it represents a system of ideas that are highly political, that represent loosely agreed upon ways of doing, being, believing, valuing combinations. And so you can't ever pin down concepts as material reality. Like a social linguist doesn't believe that. That's why we use metaphors. And one of the things that feels so real in life when you experience it more than anything is love. And that's why we can never tire of writing a song about it, because we can't pin it down. Yet we try to understand it sometimes as a material reality, because it's by, for example, using the heart. You know, my heart is a muscle, but we use this muscle as a metaphor to pin it down. But it is difficult. You are correct. It is interesting how difficult it seems to pin down. It's more material reality. We can't, because they're concepts, but we have to use metaphors in order to be able to communicate and ideate around these concepts. So I oftentimes, for me to be able to understand it and navigate its complexity, and sometimes it's useful to personify it.
Yeah, now hearing you, I even feel terrible by thinking that this persona, going back to the how you were speaking about how this persona brings you into a room to discuss certain topics while preventing you to go into the room where the real
where the real conversation
is
potentially exists. Absolutely. That's yes, there's a comedy to life and to politics and to power, and these things happen. But I think a lot of times we struggle to bring humor into the equation, and sometimes we also are afraid to be to acknowledge that we're part of the problem.
Yeah, no, I completely agree, and in that sense is that I wanted to go back to the idea of if it can be retrieved meaningfully, among people, because I also heard you speak about how it has been already kind of captured and utilized as a liability, like a disclaimer of responsibilities. And I would say also like labor management also, like, okay, you have a tenure position, but tread carefully, because despite your position, if you do not tread carefully, you're at risk. But I wonder if apart from this, very material labor relationships of power, mostly from the institution, top down, can it be retrieved? Can it be recuperated in a meaningful way to bridge gaps between, non-homogeneous individuals?
I think that's a question that I think about all the time. And I know in post-commodity too, the collective has thought about it. Like, what does it mean to make contemporary art as an indigenous collective and then have to interface with institutions that have colonial histories and agendas? And can that interaction lead to some kind of, can it mitigate colonization in some meaningful way? And it's similar with the DEI, where you have there's a concept that exists within an institution, and it's being positioned by different people with different interests in different ways. So it becomes this contested space. And it just depends on like how I'm feeling day to day. There's times when I feel fatigue, I feel discouraged, I feel oppressed. And then there's days where I feel like I want to see how I might be able to inject ideas within it that might lead to some kind of meaningful outcome, even if it's just for like one person, even if the outcome doesn't lead to any kind of bigger structural change, but it somehow helps a single individual out gain access to something that they need, that's important, that's basic, then I'll do my best, because I don't, as an individual, I can only be part of a society, and any capacity would be humble and humbling at best. And I could choose to turn my back, or I could try to engage. And for me, it's sometimes a moral. Sometimes for me, it's a moral. It's an issue of trying to be a moral human being, and it's not to propagate problems, but to try to engage the complexity and see if I can be a part of something good.
Yeah, and this last part, I think, is to me very powerful, because I think that part of the problem of, such a discourse, and by that I'm referring to the three little letters that stand for these three little words, come to be like these directives that stand in the way of individuals coming up with moral values and moral ways of conducting conflict, and instead we choose for, okay, we have this set of directives, like,
It's very, very difficult to be in proximity to this. Is extremely challenging at in psychological and spiritually speaking. That's what happens when we surrender so much of ourselves over to capitalism. We forget the true meaning of life. It creates a whole other Genesis amnesia that is even more basic than history. So I find that very, very sad. And I do try to raise these issues as generatively and productively as I can, every chance I get.
It's good to know that you're in that position, and I appreciate it, because I truly believe that's one of the key issues, that we get, and goes back to the idea of memory and recuperating, that we tend to forget, and we believe that we will be delivered this more streamlined, kind of I don't want to say prepackaged, but because that's too caricaturesque, but kind of prepackaged.
That I think that happens, that the manifestation of what you're talking about actually what happens in a workshop or a training session, or whereas that's very hard to be a subject of that, and a lot of people who face discrimination, can smell that, a million miles away. But then there's also like turning it against itself and hacking it and modifying it. But what you realize is that the dilemma is like, well, one might ask, well, why should I have to engage this? Like, I'm the why do I have to fix this if I'm the person facing discrimination? And then you're in a dilemma, you're in another conundrum, and you realize that if you don't and you let other people do it, well, then you get things like the diversity, workshop. So everything's a dilemma. Everything is I think there's a comedy to everything. As dark as the comedy gets, it's there.
Yeah, if you want to be a good person, you have to fit the system and you have to help improve, make the next version with larger horizon, and that's a paradox that I do feel. It's funny and terrible.
Yeah. I mean, you have to laugh at the terrible elicits the laugh, right? If you really intellectualize it and you're honest. But yeah, I think that we oftentimes in the collective post-commodity will refer to situations like this as vexed. And that's one thing I love about being an artist, is getting into these places that are vexed and assuming trying to allow yourself to embody the problem, allow yourself to be part of it, and also allow yourself to try to complicate it and I find that a more interesting problem space as an artist than to just be someone who is asserting the privileges that come with being an artist and treating the world like it's an arena and you're in the box seat, the football game, and you're critiquing the players and the rules and the system and the calls and the game, but you're not in the game. It's a lot harder when you're in the game. And I like to speak from that position of being in it, in the mud, in the dirt, in the complexity, in the noise, and not as someone who is having washed his hands clean of it, but someone who is really part of the problem.
Yeah, and speaking to that, I think about how you position yourself through the first work that I really appreciate very much, this sense of temporality, both ways. That there's like this enormous amount of time, kind of pushing the paper, going through the bureaucracy, going through this kind of maze of weird complications in order to have this really small window of time for this vexed 4 days, for this vexed, like I see it like, are we talking about shamanic medicine? Are we not? Are we talking about commodities? And then it just goes away. It cannot stay. And, it has to move somewhere else, but still going back at it in this frame of time.
One of the things that happens with that is you built a new public memory. People started to look at the sky. They stopped looking at the wall. They started looking at the sky. And that manifestation of seeing that continuity had immense psychological and spiritual and social and cultural impact on the region. And it was because it was a manifestation of some level of success in having repositioned authority and the apparatus of government to support your will, one's will as citizens of the region. And that changed that region culturally and economically and politically, had in very positive ways, in ways that really restored a lot of people's dignity. That's what I mean by positive. It's a restoration of dignity and relationships and memory and seeing each other in ways that made those 4 days absolutely worth it. Working 10 years for that, you could do a lot in 4 days if you spend 10 years planning for it.
Yeah, no, I really love it. And I think it speaks volume to that repositioning,
But it is vexed, and it does have to go away. And there's other things that happen too. But
yeah, I don't know.
It opened a portal, and for 4 days we were able to live in an entirely different world, a world completely remade for 4 days. And when it closed up, everything went back to business as usual, but some things got stuck in this realm and they took root. And so I think that gave me a lot of hope. And it had a lot to do with what I was saying earlier about how do we deal with these identity projects that, cause so much harm. It's like, well, what made that possible? What made repellents possible? It's that people really cared about the place they called home. They cared about the land. In Douglas, Arizona, and Agua Prieta, Sonora, people have pride. People remembered. They remembered they could see their grandparents on the land. They could remember things. There were times when you used to race horses. The U.S. ranchers would race against the Mexican ranchers right along the borderline. It was a love for those memories and that land that people could see very clearly who they were. And in some cases, they felt a sense of shame and also a sense of a restoration of dignity because they had subjugated the reality that their ancestors were opata from the region.
Yeah, I guess, sometimes just the ability to go back to the name,
Yeah.
Just to speak it out aloud.
It could be so simple sometimes, yeah.
Yeah, and somehow, it really goes like in contest against this obfuscation that I think, it obscures, these three little words kind of obfuscates precisely these complexities, this kind of, for lack of a better word, negotiations that we have to establish among ourselves, in order to, there will be, there are borders. I have like a skin that is not the same as your skin, my body is not your body, but that doesn't mean that, we cannot be together somehow. Yeah. My dearest friend, we have been at it for a few minutes, and I would love to continue, but I know that you have also maybe to take some rest and take care of other matters. But
thank you.
Again, I want to thank you so much for this time and the conversation. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Ricardo. Thank you so much, SOMA. And thank you so much to the cohort. I appreciate having the opportunity to spend time with you, even if it's through Zoomlandia. But I just wish you all a good night and wish you all a fun and productive time working together in Mexico. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, my friend. Love.
Talk to you soon.
Yeah, will do.
Okay.
Buenas
noches.
Buenas noches.
Ciao.